What makes a prison notorious? It isn't merely the thickness of its walls, the strength of its bars, or the infamy of the criminals it contains. A prison earns its dark place in history when its very name becomes a synonym for horror. When the stories whispered about it are not just of justice, but of cruelty. It's the moment a prison ceases to be a simple building of confinement and becomes a machine, purpose-built to break the human spirit. These are the institutions where society sends the men and women it fears the most. But sometimes, the prison itself becomes more terrifying than any soul it holds. They become symbols of unchecked royal power, of the casual brutality of war, of the soul-crushing despair of total isolation. They are the hells on earth, constructed from stone and steel, and mortared with human misery. They are living monuments to the darkest parts of our own nature. In this investigation, we will descend into 5 of these legendary institutions. We will walk their haunted corridors, uncovering the stories of their most famous inmates. We will learn of the brutal wardens who ruled them, and the historical events that sealed their infamous reputations. From a modern fortress in the middle of a bay, designed for psychological warfare, to a medieval cage built for queens awaiting the executioner's axe, and finally, to a place that was nothing less than a factory for genocide. We will explore how these places were designed not just to hold the body, but to annihilate the soul. Join us as we unlock the gates to history's most notorious prisons. The countdown begins now. Our countdown begins on a barren island set in the freezing, treacherous waters of San Francisco Bay. Number 5. Alcatraz, known to the world as the Rock. Opened as a federal penitentiary in 1934, Alcatraz was not designed for rehabilitation. It was designed to be the end of the line. This was where the American justice system sent its most notorious, violent, and escape-prone criminals, men like Al Capone and Machine Gun Kelly. It was built to be a symbol, a cold, brutal, and utterly inescapable fortress. The horror of Alcatraz was not one of medieval torture, but of modern psychological warfare. In its early years, the prison operated under a strict rule of silence, where inmates were forbidden to speak for years on end. A policy designed to drive men to madness. The cells were cramped. The routine was monotonous, and the guards were trained to show no empathy. But the cruelest feature of Alcatraz was its location. On a clear day with the right wind, the inmates could hear the sounds of life. Drifting across the water from San Francisco, the laughter of people at parties, the ringing of cable cars, the sounds of a vibrant city they could see but never touch. It was a constant, tortuous reminder of the world they had lost forever. This soul-crushing environment bred a unique kind of desperation, and in 1962, that desperation fueled the most ingenious prison break in American history. Frank Morris, a man with a genius-level IQ, along with brothers John and Clarence Anglin, spent months meticulously planning their escape. Using sharpened spoons stolen from the mess hall, they slowly chipped away at the crumbling concrete around the air vents in their cells. They constructed lifelike dummy heads from soap, toilet paper, and real human hair from the prison barber shop, which they placed in their beds to fool the night guards. On the night of June 11th, they slipped through the vents, climbed to the roof, and vanished into the night, launching a makeshift raft constructed from over 50 stolen raincoats. They were never seen again. The FBI officially concluded that they drowned in the bay's violent currents, but no bodies were ever definitively recovered. The true brilliance of their escape isn't whether they survived, but what it reveals about the prison they fled. Alcatraz was designed to convince men that resistance was futile and escape was impossible. But its crushing psychological pressure became the very catalyst for an escape so daring, it remains a legend to this day. It proved that no matter how strong the steel or how cold the stone, you cannot imprison the will to be free. From the modern despair of Alcatraz, we travel back in time to a place where the horror was not of isolation, but of royal vengeance. At number 4, we have the Tower of London. For nearly 1,000 years, this imposing fortress on the banks of the River Thames has been a symbol of English power, a palace, a treasury, an armory. But its most enduring legacy is as a prison. This was not a place for common criminals, but a high-status cage for the enemies of the crown. Its terror was not born from physical brutality, but from a chilling psychological dread. It was the place where the most powerful people in the kingdom learned their power was an illusion. To be sent to the tower was to know your fate was likely sealed. The most infamous entrance was the Traitor's Gate, a water gate opening onto the river. As a prisoner's boat passed through it, leaving the world of the living behind, they knew the chances of emerging alive were almost zero. Inside, conditions could be comfortable, but that comfort was itself a form of torture, a quiet, civilized prelude to a violent death. The tower was the antechamber to the executioner's block. No story better encapsulates this dread than that of Queen Anne Boleyn, the second wife of Henry VIII. In 1533, she had entered the tower in triumph, staying in the royal apartments in preparation for her magnificent coronation. Just 3 years later, in 1536, she returned to the very same apartments, but this time as a condemned prisoner, accused of treason, adultery, and incest by a king desperate to discard her. She was a queen one day and a prisoner the next. For 17 days, she was trapped in this gilded cage, caught between the memory of her greatest triumph and the terrifying reality of her impending doom. She swung between hysterical laughter and weeping despair as the political machinery of the state, controlled by her husband, moved inexorably towards her destruction. Unlike most traitors, who were publicly executed on nearby Tower Hill, Henry granted on the mercy of a private execution, hidden from the jeering crowds within the tower's walls. He even imported a specialist swordsman from France to ensure a clean cut. On the morning of May 19th, Anne Boleyn walked to a scaffold erected on the Tower Green, and in one swift, silent stroke, the Queen of England was dead. Her story, and the stories of countless others, Sir Walter Raleigh, Lady Jane Grey, Sir Thomas More, cemented the Tower's reputation. It was the ultimate instrument of state power, a place where justice was secondary to the will of the monarch. It stands today as a monument to the chilling truth that the higher you climb, the further and more brutally you can fall. The prisons we have seen so far were tools of the state, designed for punishment or political terror. But our third entry is a different kind of hell, one born from the chaos and desperation of war. This is Andersonville, the deadliest prisoner of war camp of the American Civil War. It was not a place of guillotines or gas chambers, but of slow, agonizing death on a colossal scale. Constructed by the Confederacy in Georgia in 1864, Andersonville was essentially a 26-acre field of open ground surrounded by a high stockade. It was built to hold 10,000 Union soldiers, but within months, over 32,000 were crammed inside. The horror of Andersonville was the horror of neglect. There was no shelter from the blistering Georgia sun or the freezing winter rains, save for what pathetic tents the men could fashion from blankets and sticks. The only source of water was a small creek that flowed through the camp, which quickly became a sickening open sewer, contaminated with the filth and disease of thousands of men. Rations were scarce, often just a few spoonfuls of uncooked cornmeal a day. Disease was rampant. Scurvy, dysentery, and typhoid fever swept through the camp like wildfire. Men wasted away, their bodies covered in sores, their minds lost to delirium. In its 14 months of operation, nearly 13,000 men died. In this abyss of human suffering, civilization itself began to collapse. A brutal gang of prisoners known as the Andersonville Raiders formed, preying on their weaker comrades, stealing their meager rations, their clothing, even the gold from their teeth. They ruled the camp through terror, beating and murdering with impunity, but even in hell. Some men refused to surrender their humanity. In response, another group of prisoners formed, the Regulators. They organized, armed themselves with clubs and fists, and declared war on the raiders. They hunted them down, held a trial, and, with the camp commander's permission, hanged 6 of the raider leaders. It was a desperate, brutal act of self-governance in a place abandoned by God and man. The diary of one survivor, John Ransom, reads, "It is a hell on earth. I have no doubt that there are 1,000 dead bodies lying outside the stockade, unburied. It is a sight that is terrible to gaze upon." Andersonville was not just a prison. It was a testament to the horrors of war that rage far from the battlefield. It stands as a chilling monument to the thousands who died not from a bullet, but from starvation, disease, and the absolute breakdown of the systems meant to preserve human dignity. There are prisons designed to punish the body, and there are prisons designed to break the mind. And then there are those rare places, built for the sole purpose of erasing a man from existence. At number 2, we have such a place, the infamous French penal colony of Devil's Island, located off the coast of French Guiana. This was not just a prison, it was a living tomb. The French government didn't send men here to serve a sentence. They sent them here to die. The horror of Devil's Island was absolute and all-encompassing. First, there was the green hell of the jungle itself, the suffocating heat, the constant torment of insects, and the rampant tropical diseases like malaria and yellow fever that could kill a man in days. Then there was the human element. The guards were notoriously sadistic, and the forced labor in the logging camps was so brutal it was effectively a death sentence. But the true terror was the hopelessness. Escape was considered impossible. The mainland was miles of impenetrable jungle. The sea was patrolled by sharks. drawn to the blood and offal regularly dumped from the settlements. To be sent to Devil's Island was to be forgotten by the world, condemned to rot away in a tropical purgatory. No story illustrates the psychological torment of this place better than that of its most famous prisoner, Captain Alfred Dreyfus, a promising Jewish officer. In the French army, Dreyfus was falsely convicted of treason in 1894 in a firestorm of anti-Semitism. He was stripped of his rank in a humiliating public ceremony and sentenced to life on Devil's Island for 4 years. He lived in complete isolation in a small stone hut under constant watch, forbidden to speak to anyone. He endured fevers, malnutrition, and the crushing mental weight of his unjust conviction, all while his case tore France apart back home. He was a man utterly alone, fighting for his sanity against a system that wanted him to simply vanish. Dreyfus eventually survived and was exonerated, but his ordeal exposed the true nature of Devil's Island to the world. It was the endpoint of justice, a place where the state could dispose of its undesirables, hidden far from public view. It represented the terror of total abandonment, a warning that a civilized nation could operate a system of breathtaking cruelty as long as it was kept out of sight, in its own private hell on earth. We have arrived at the end of our countdown, at a place that transcends the very concept of a prison. It had no daring escapes, no famous political prisoners who lived to tell their tale. It had only victims. This is a place so dark, it forces us to confront the absolute depths of human cruelty. At number 1, Tuol Sleng, also known as Security Prison 21, in the heart of Phnom Penh, Cambodia. Before the horror, it was a high school, a place of learning and youthful energy. But in 1975, when the Khmer Rouge regime under Pol Pot seized control of Cambodia, they transformed this school into their central hub for torture and extermination. S21 was not designed for confinement. It was a bureaucratic factory of death. Its sole purpose was to process human beings into confessions and then into corpses. An estimated 20,000 people were brought through the gates of Tuol Sleng: doctors, teachers, engineers, monks, government officials, and eventually Khmer Rouge members themselves who had fallen out of favor. Upon arrival, their journey into oblivion began with chilling precision. They were photographed, their faces captured in haunting black and white portraits that would become their only memorial. They were stripped of their possessions and their identities, given only a number. The former classrooms were converted into tiny brick cells and interrogation rooms. The school's 10 rules were posted on the wall, the first of which was, "You must answer accordingly to my question. Don't turn them away." What followed was unimaginable torture, designed not to uncover truth, but to force a confession that fit the regime's paranoid narrative. Prisoners were beaten, electrocuted, waterboarded, and subjected to medical experiments until they confessed to being spies for the CIA or the KGB. Once a confession was extracted, the prisoners' journey was over. They were loaded onto trucks under the cover of darkness and driven to the nearby killing fields of Choang Ik. There, to save bullets, they were bludgeoned to death and pushed into mass graves. Of the 20,000 souls who entered Tuol Sleng, only a handful are known to have survived. This was not the chaotic cruelty of a POW camp or the vengeful act of a king. This was systematic, industrialized evil, carried out with meticulous, bureaucratic efficiency. Tuol Sleng stands as a chilling testament to the horror of a political ideology gone mad. A place where the value of a human life was reduced to a signed confession and a black and white photograph. It is not just the most notorious prison in history. It is a scar on the conscience of humanity itself. We have walked the cold corridors of 5 hells on Earth. From the psychological despair of Alcatraz, where freedom was a sound on the wind, to the political dread of the Tower of London, where power was just a prelude to the axe. We have witnessed the mass death by neglect at Andersonville, a testament to the horrors of war beyond the battlefield. We felt the soul-crushing isolation of Devil's Island, a place designed to erase men from memory. And finally, we stared into the bureaucratic heart of evil at Tuol Sleng, a schoolhouse turned into a factory for genocide. Each of these institutions perfected a unique form of cruelty. They show us that horror is not monolithic. It takes many forms. It can be the cold, calculated pressure of a modern supermax, the slow, agonizing dread of a royal death sentence, the chaotic misery of mass starvation, the crushing weight of utter hopelessness, or the meticulous, industrialized efficiency of pure evil. These places are more than just historical sites or dark tourist attractions. They are monuments, built of stone and blood and suffering. They serve as solemn, eternal warnings. They warn us of the danger of absolute power, of the fragility of civilization, and of the terrifying darkness that humanity is capable of when empathy is extinguished. They force us to look at the worst parts of our own history, not for morbid entertainment, but so that we may never forget the cost of creating such places. Because the walls of these prisons don't just hold the ghosts of the past, they hold a lesson for our future.